Hi, so it's finally time for me to submit my review of the Bomber Mafia, which I finished over the course of a journey to Chandigarh, back to Mumbai and so on. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and it's really one of my favorite subjects because I grew up with this kind of discussion happening around the dinner table. So it's really about aircraft set in the Second World War, talking about things like B-29 Super Fortress bombers and stuff like that, which I've been hearing ever since I've been growing up. I've been reading Commando comics, and there's been a lot of discussion because my dad used to be an Indian Air Force pilot, and my brother's deeply into aviation. He loves flying aircraft, and apparently he told me that he's flown one of these aircraft. I don't remember whether it was the B-17 or the B-29, but both these are basically American bombers which had huge payload capacities for the time and were really massive and armored and so on and so forth. And the first one, if I'm not mistaken, was used in the theater in Germany. And the second one, the B-29, was kind of developed for the long range that it would need to go and attack Japan. But anyway, back to the book. Why is it called the Bomber Mafia? That's immediately intriguing. It's by Malcolm Gladwell, who's a famous author, best-selling author of so many books. So I love the fact that he's chosen this subject because he has the freedom to do so, I think, now. As a successful author, he can pick his subjects. And that really gives you a sense of freedom in reading the book, that, this author is looking at subjects that really interest him, and he's not too worried about commercial success and making the book a hit and so on and so forth. So it's a bit of a liberating feeling even as a reader. And I'm sure as an author, he must have really enjoyed it. This book is called The Bomber Mafia because it's really based on a set of people that started looking at the US Air Force even before it became the Air Force. So prior to the war, it was actually a wing of the Army. And only in 1947, I think the US Air Force actually took shape, which was after the war. But during the war, there was a set of people that ran this entire Air Tactical Corps or something like that as part of the Army. And they were based off somewhere in the back of Beyond in Alabama, not close to Langley, where the Army base was, which they were a part of, because they had very different ideas about the war. And the Army, being a fairly traditional force, may have opposed some of their ideas actually. And they were actually revolutionary in how they envisaged the war. They were looking at technology and the advent of aviation as a way to kind of wage war in a very different way and win wars entirely without the help of the Army. And so that was an interesting thought. It was a really captivating thought for these people. They were idealists. They wanted to win wars without too much damage, collateral damage, especially to civilian populations, and even to loss of life, even with soldiers. And so they were looking at a humanistic, idealistic way to win the war. And their idea was that if you have enough firepower in air power, and you kind of have these massive bombers that can precision bomb targets, strategic targets, at the right time, right place, then they could end the war without too much bloodshed. And that was really the idealism that drove them. And the people that did this were called the Bomber Mafia. And so that's what the title of the book is about. I love the book in terms of its theme, because any book that has to go beyond just its subject or its sphere of expertise, so to speak. So this is a book about war, but it's not a war story. It's not so much about the war itself. It is about different theaters of action that the Air Force saw, the US Air Force particularly, but it's not really about that story. It is a theme that is much larger. It is about idealism and humanism and compassion versus being pragmatic and perhaps indulging in inhuman acts to win a war, and which one kind of wins out in the end. So it's really a very interesting theme. Even if you're not a war buff or you're not an Air Force or aviation kind of buff, you will still enjoy this book because of that theme. And I certainly did for that reason. The story really is that the Bomber Mafia actually tries to put its strategies into place, but they're not able to succeed phenomenally. There are lots of challenges. So those challenges came in the way. He digresses a little bit and talks about the Norden bomb site. Actually, it's not so much a digression. It's really very pertinent to the entire subject. But he talks about a gentleman called Norden who was very passionate about building the Norden bomb site. And he was a perfectionist, and he built something that was a really fantastic piece of targeting machinery. So the Norden bomb site was really a technological marvel for the time, and was very, very accurate. And it was built to a certain standard of perfection that Mr. Norden demanded from his production process. But even then, there were lots of issues, because there were conditions that, it used to get really cold at the heights that these bombers used to fly at. And typically in the Europe theater, they used to use B-17s, which are the bombers that the US Air Force had. And they used to fly at a fairly high altitude. And to be able to put their bombs very accurately, they needed to be able to have clear skies and not cloud cover. So without, when the cloud cover was there, obviously the northern bomb sight is not going to be much help. It can't see through the clouds because this was an optic instrument. And the other problem was that if you're flying at such heights, there's temperature variations which will cause the oil to thicken inside, and the ball bearings not to move properly and so on and so forth. So all these issues led to the fact that some of these raids, actually a lot of these raids, were not really very, very successful, and they weren't able to what these guys ideologically wanted and what they were idealistic about, they weren't able to achieve with these kinds of runs, because these were initial days. The idea was great, but it wasn't. They weren't able to execute it brilliantly because of all these problems, technological problems, problems of conditions, and so on and so forth. So because these raids were not very successful, they had to look at other strategies to be able to fight the war, the air war. And the British had already been following a very different strategy. They'd been looking at generalized bombing of civilian populations to demoralize the country and force them to surrender. So that had been going on. They would go in at night and they would not really look at precision bombing at all. So they would not look at putting the bombs exactly where the strategic targets were. They would just bomb entire cities and essentially lay the bombs wherever they went from really high up, so that the populations, the civilian populations that were targeted, would be demoralized and the country would be forced to capitulate. So that's really the crux of the story. We're looking at two different approaches. We're looking at somebody who wants to precision bomb. We're looking at somebody who wants to avoid too much collateral damage. And on the other hand, you're looking at a strategy where you're carpet bombing literally civilian populations and not worrying about where the bombs might fall, essentially to demoralize the country and force them to capitulate. So what he talks about in the book is that this strategy actually didn't turn out to be extremely effective, because even London was, as famously, London was attacked and bombed all the time right through the war, and right at the end of the war also there were V1 and V2 rockets aimed at London. And London suffered terribly in that sense, but the population quickly grew used to this the bombing raids, and they would take it fairly casually, and he talks about some of that in the book as well. So it wasn't actually terribly effective at enforcing any kind of end to the war, but it did result in a massive loss of lives on both sides, in Germany as well as in the UK. And we know about some of the villainy that the Germans kind of undertook during the Second World War, but what a lot of people don't know is that the British also followed a similar strategy of deliberately targeting civilian populations in massive bomber raids that went across multiple cities and caused firestorms and led to a massive amount of civilian deaths in that country. So that's something that he talks about. He talks about this strategy that was driven by this guy called Arthur Bomber Harris, who led the Royal Air Force. And that story kind of wraps itself up there, and he moves to the Japanese theater of war, so to speak, where the US gets involved against Japan after Pearl Harbor, and then they have to look at how they can attack the Japanese mainland. This story is also the story of two personalities. One is Haywood Hansell, if I'm not mistaken. I think his name was Haywood Hansell. And the other person is Curtis LeMay. I think Curtis LeMay used to report to Haywood Hansell, but ultimately replaces him in the Japanese theater of war as the commander there of operations. And that's because Hansell can't deliver the results that he wants. Because when he goes in there, he's still looking at the philosophy of precision bombing. He's looking at targets to acquire. He's looking at bombing them out so that strategically it can impact the war, and so on and so forth. And that's not really seeing much results, because for the first time, and this is also a really interesting part of the book, for the first time when the bombers went up to Japan, they came up across something called a jet stream, which they ran into and were not able to therefore precision bomb anything, because they had huge mistakes in their calculations that made it really tough as they came in over Tokyo or around Tokyo or Japan to be able to bomb anything effectively. So because Japan was so far away from any American controlled territory, they actually had to develop a new bomber with a longer range. The B-17 wouldn't be enough to reach Japan, because I think it had 1,000-mile range approximately. And they had to look at something called the B-29 Super Fortress, which was a much bigger airplane with a greater payload capacity, but also a massive 3,000-mile range effectively, I think. And so that actually enabled them to start bombing Japan, and that's what Haywood Hansell was looking at. And Haywood Hansell gets replaced by Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay is a different character. He's quite a character in the book. He's very demanding of his troops, but also when he's He gives them tough orders. He's the first one taking off, and he's leading the entire charge, so to speak, and putting himself in danger. So the other people end up trusting him. He's very effective as somebody who implements plans. And so that's borne out earlier when he's actually leading the airplanes, the bombers that Haywood Hansel has directed to kind of precision bomb Germany. And he talks about being able to hit the targets and therefore not avoiding gunfire and kind of flying straight without deviating from their flight pattern, which of course is very counterintuitive, because if you are being fired at, you want to take evasive action. And he says, no, none of that is going to happen on this flight, because every time we take evasive action, we are missing out on bombing the targets. We are not effective. So he actually flies in, but he orders his troops that you're not going to take any, he orders his flight, essentially his airmen, to not take any evasive action, but he takes off first. And he's at the lead, he's the lead airplane in that flight. So that's the kind of person he is. So Curtis LeMay replaces Haywood Hansel. So it's one ideology replacing another. And when this happens, something terrible happens. And that's where the book kind of reaches a turning point. He talks about that throughout the book at some level. But really, when Curtis LeMay takes over, what happens is that he decides he's going to look at a very different strategy. In the meanwhile, very important digression here, in the meanwhile, there are researchers in the US that have been sitting together and designing incendiary bombs, and they're looking at what is the most efficient way for something to catch fire and stay on fire. And they developed something that you may have heard of, napalm. And once that is developed, it's a game changer. So these incendiaries are loaded onto these massive bombers, and hundreds of them are sent over to Japan by Curtis LeMay. And his orders are not to fly at 20,000 feet or very, very high above the, through the jet stream, which is very challenging. He goes in below the jet stream. Not only that, he's going in below cloud cover. So he's going in really low. And this is a really dangerous mission, because if there's any anti-aircraft gunnery or any defenses, they can effectively target these bombers really well. And you stand to lose because they're so far away from home or American-controlled territory. They could lose a whole lot of bombers, even 25%, 50% of their force, and that would be the end of Curtis LeMay. So he deploys these bombers. They're going with napalm bombs that have been specifically designed to target Japanese homes. They've been tested on Japanese homes, which have straw mats, and they're very fragile in that sense and very susceptible to fire. And he goes in and indiscriminately bombs Tokyo. There is no target that is written there, which is like a factory outside Tokyo, or a tank factory here, or an armament factory there, or an ammo dump somewhere. It's Tokyo, just bomb Tokyo. And they go there and drop their entire payload. They surprise the Japanese. There are no air defenses. They're not expecting this to happen. All these hundreds of bombers reach, and they drop their payload on Tokyo. And there are massive fires as a result, and over 100,000 people die in that one raid. And that's how this strategy plays out. Huge civilian losses, indiscriminate bombing, air power, yes, and probably winning wars, yes, eventually, but at a huge cost. There's another part of this book that for Indians particularly will be of great interest, and I've heard these conversations between my brother and my dad at home all the time. This was the Hump operation, Flying the Hump, which was really an American base in India that flew across the Everest to reach a base in China where they would refuel so that they could continue against Japan, fly operations against Japan. And apparently this is a massive operation with thousands and thousands of flights across the Everest, where the air is really thin and is really difficult to fly because you need a lot of skill. These bombers have to be heavily loaded with fuel and their payloads and so on. So it's really difficult flying, and it's some of the most inhospitable terrain known to man. It's the Everest, and it's the Everest ranges. And so essentially, if you crash, and a lot of them did crash, they'd just go into the mountains and there was no hope of survival. Even if you survived the crash, you pretty much ended up dead there on the mountainside. And when these people were flying, apparently they would see a lot of the skeletons of these aircraft peppered over the mountainsides. So that was something that was a little bit of Indian history, because these operations were based in India and then they were flown out of here because it was British controlled territory at the time. So that's a little something that I really enjoyed reading about. In fact, I made a kind of pledge to read a little more about it. I'd love to know more. Probably get a recommendation from my brother about which books to pick up on that subject. Really interesting part of Indian aviation history that a lot of us don't know a lot about. So Curtis LeMay finds this kind of bombing really effective, and then he carries on bombing Japan with these massive number of bombers with huge payloads, napalm, targeting specific Japanese civilian populations so that the entire nation capitulates. Capitulation doesn't happen until the nuclear bombs are dropped. But what's amazing is that he continues the bombing even when the nuclear bombs fall. And that's what this book mentions. I found that really amazing. And apparently a lot of the decision making wasn't really coming from the real, top executive, the president and so on and so forth. It was actually decisions being made at the base by the general, who was Curtis LeMay at the time. And he just kept on going. He just kept on bombing Japan, kept on with his strategy of completely obliterating towns, cities and civilian populations. So when I was reading this book, there was a little bit of consternation, because Haywood Hansel, who was the idealist and wanted to end the war very quickly without too much casualty, he kind of ends up being a bit of a failure and he's sent back. He's kind of portrayed as a bit of an idealist who doesn't really know how to execute plans or do anything. And it kind of looked like he's ending up on the losing side, and people like Curtis LeMay, who are pragmatists, who decide that anything, the ends justify the means, are coming out as the winners. And of course, he went on to become air chief and so on. But you can trust Malcolm Gladwell and read the end, you'll find something really interesting. And that's how he resolves the theme. And I find the way he does it is really beautiful. And that's primarily why I love the book. I love the book because, I'm from an aviation kind of family. My brother's still in aviation. I've read Commando comics growing up, and so I recognize some of the planes and some of the stories here. And I've read a whole lot of other books as well. But even if you're not, the theme in this book is well worth regarding, because it's very contemporary. It's even today, it's something that we have to look at, and it's a moral dilemma that we face. And Malcolm Gladwell has done a really good job of illustrating that through this entire book, while going into war history and looking at some of these themes through that lens. So I recommend it really strongly. I would give it 4.5 stars. It's a really good book. Like I said, his creative freedom really comes across in this book. He's not looking to please anybody. He's kind of looking at producing a good book by researching a great subject that interests him. And he finds it really intriguing to kind of go into this. And he's obviously met a bunch of people, researched it, and all of that personalized kind of research comes through in the book. And it's really enjoyable as a read. Again, it's very light reading. It doesn't really tax your mind. And by the end of it, it actually kind of gets you fairly emotionally involved and very charged. Because some of these themes are really tough to kind of contemplate. Something like the nuclear bomb being dropped on a civilian population and so on, so forth. And some of the Japanese, how they react to some of this later, is kind of gives you food for thought in terms of what human life really means and how far we've come in the last century. So, Bomber Mafia, well recommended. Tell me what you thought of the review. Leave your comments below and recommend other books that you'd like me to review. I'm going to move on to some other book. Hope to see you back here soon.